and welcome to the Leopard Spots podcast, presented by Fractional, a leading provider of risk and compliance services to fintechs, banks, and crypto firms. Join the founders, owners, investors, and senior executives as they dive deep into the world of business and entrepreneurship. Trust me, these guys have seen it all, and they're here to share their wisdom with you. So, let's get going. Please welcome your host, Ryan Simo.
Welcome back to the Leopard Spots podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Simo. As always, this is brought to you by Fractional.co. We are a leading global provider of risk and compliance leadership services to banks, fintechs, crypto firms, private equity. So check us out at Fractional.co and be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast as well. And our next guest, I'm really thrilled, and I think a lot of M&T Nation, old M&T Nation, will be thrilled to have with us the former president, chief operating officer, and also chief risk officer, which I want to point out, of M&T Bank, Rich Gold. So Rich, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here. Good to see you as always.
Absolutely. Great to see you. And, I was saying before we started recording, I think 26 years ago or so, I started at M&T when I was there.
That's
and
right.
That's when I met you. And, I'll say this to you as we're sitting here, but if I think about my career over time, there's certain people you meet along the way. I'm sure you probably have the same scenario, who had an impact, whether it was implied or explicit, just had an impact. And you were that person for me.
Well,
certainly that guidepost, that North Star. I was in your orbit, it seemed, most of my career. And so that was something I've always treasured. And so to have you here and talk through your career, things that you've learned over time, stuff that you're doing today, now that, you're obviously not with M&T from a day-to-day, you're on the board, but talk about your career and things that you've learned. So I'd love to do that. But before we get going, I have to just say, I've been asked, and I was actually asked when I walked in here, what Leopard Spots podcast means, because, and I've been asked this a bunch of times. So Leopard Spots has nothing to do with Fractional, because they're two totally different things. But I went to Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, as did your daughter,
as
Jane.
my daughter did.
And we were the Leopards, the only school in the country with a Leopards mascot. And so when I was thinking about what to name this thing, I thought an homage to Lafayette somehow, some way. So Leopard Spots podcast. So there you go. And Maddie, who's producing this, asked me the question when I walked in. I had to clear it up. So anyway, but so Rich, let's start. We'll get into your career and everything. Obviously, I want to get into multiple aspects. First one is, you went to Cornell, you then went to NYU Business School, and then you end up at, Bankers Trust, I believe it was, Citi, and then M&T. Mm-hmm. And that's really where you had this 35-year career doing a whole host of things. Let's start how you got to Cornell, what you were thinking when you got there. Is it like, hey, I want to be the president of a top 15 bank? Did you want to do something else? Let's start there.
Sure. That's kind of funny. My father and my brother were both construction workers. They were sheet metal workers. Okay. And, so they were union guys in the whole 9 yards. And when I was looking for colleges, I looked at Cornell, and they had a program in industrial and labor relations, which is heavily, labor management relations and those sorts of things. And so I just kind of gravitated to it as my target. And I obviously applied to a couple of other schools, but I was lucky enough to get in. I would never get in today, I can guarantee you that. Yeah. But back then, I weaseled my way in. Yeah. And so going to Cornell was only, because of that connection, which was sort of a meager connection, because I didn't really understand what the whole curriculum was about at that point. But, I got lucky. I kind of gravitated to Cornell. I was able to get accepted and went through that program. That program was incredible. Mm-hmm. So that's...
So you go to Cornell, and then what were you thinking about? Were you thinking, I'm going to go into finance? I'm going to go.
Yeah. So most people that go into the industrial and labor relations program at Cornell, I think, set their sights on law school, becoming labor lawyers and things like that. And I thought I was going to become a lawyer. Yeah. As I started to get into my later years at school, going into my senior year in particular, I took a couple of labor law courses, and I realized I don't like this. I mean, it's a lot of reading, a lot of, it's just a lot of detailed work, into case study and all that kind of thing. And I wasn't comfortable with it. And so I pivoted and took the GMATs, and I thought I would go and get my MBA. And I got accepted to NYU, but on a deferred basis.
And you're from New York City.
Yeah, I grew up on Long Island.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So basically what they said was, we'd love to have you in our MBA program, but first you have to go out and get at least 2 years of work experience and call us back when you do.
Yeah.
So I had been in food and beverage, like to pay my way through school. I worked at the Cornell Hotel School and as a bartender and a beverage controller and a beverage department supervisor and all those kind of jobs. And one of my best friends was in the hotel school. He graduated a year before me and moved out to Lake Tahoe and was working at Harrah's, hotel and casino there. And so when I graduated, I knew I had to get work experience to go to NYU. So I took a prolonged vacation and went out and visited him in Lake Tahoe. And I wound up getting a job as a food and beverage director out there. They saw Cornell and they saw that I worked at the hotel school. So they assumed I went to the Cornell Hotel School. And I got hired for this tour boat company out there. And I worked for a couple of years out in Tahoe with the idea to come back and then go to NYU. And I had a bit of a circuitous route coming back. I wound up in the restaurant business. I worked for a company called Restaurant Associates, which owned a bunch of famous restaurants in New York City.
Wow, I didn't know this.
And I was like a food and beverage guy.
Wow.
The thing with that business though is when you start to do the math in terms of the number of hours you work divided by how much you get paid, it's not a good proposition.
No.
So anyway, I was bound back to go back to NYU, and they were glad to have me back. I took one look at the price of going back full time, and there was no way I could do it. It was just way too expensive. And I happened to be reading a Cornell alumni newsletter at the time, and there was an advertisement for a bank called Bankers Trust, which is gone now. It's Deutsche Bank, basically. And it marketed free tuition reimbursement. So I applied to the job at Bankers Trust. I wound up getting it. And they paid for my, I went to NYU at night, and they paid for the first half of it.
Wow.
And then I went and moved over to Citibank, and they paid the second half of it. And I got my MBA paid through the banking business. That was the only reason why I got into banking. I had no aspiration. I had no sort of objective to make my way into that business. I simply started in that industry because they paid for my tuition.
That's unbelievable. I didn't know this.
Yeah, well, it's,
all these years I've known you, and I didn't.
Yeah, you thought I was skilled. It's all luck.
Geez, I didn't know. Were you responsible for the menus in the cafeteria then? When is something you want to tell me? So, okay, so then now you're in banking, and it's, to me, banking is one of these. It's like a Venus flytrap. Once you're in, most people just stumble into it.
Yeah.
And then once you're into it, you're like, okay, well, this is interesting.
Yeah.
And then you just stay, generally speaking.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
So let's talk then. You make your way to M&T.
Right.
In Buffalo.
Yep.
Had you been to Buffalo before?
I went to Buffalo for a wedding once.
For a wedding.
That was about it.
Usually it's people like, I went to Niagara Falls once and I drove through, and
no, there was no game plan there either.
Right. So you just ended up.
No, what happened was, I was at Citibank and I was finishing up my MBA, and I got recruited by M&T.
Yep.
And I said to them, I would be interested in working for you, but I'm not moving to Buffalo. I'm a New York City guy, whatever. And M&T had a subsidiary bank in New York City, as you remember, called the East New York Savings Bank.
That's right.
Subsequently folded into the M&T brand and name. And they were looking for people to work at East New York. And so they made me the offer to work down in New York City. So I left Citibank, and I thought it was a good move because city's big, right? So I was in product development in their marketing group, and I was only focused on product development. I figured if I went to a smaller institution, I might get a broader sort of view of what goes on in a financial institution. And so I made the decision to leave Citi, and I went to M&T, which was the East New York Savings Bank, and worked for them in a number of different roles for about 2.5 years. And then I was invited to transfer to Buffalo. And to this day, I couldn't tell you the thought process. Honestly, when I agreed to move to Buffalo and sort of packed up my car, I was living in Forest Hills, Queens at the time. I had to look at a map to figure out where Buffalo was. Right. I mean, I was looking and I'm like, oh my God, I'm moving to Ohio.
Basically, yeah.
I mean, it's, I mean, when you grow up in Long Island and have that kind of the life that I had, anything over the Tappan Zee Bridge is upstate New York. And you didn't differentiate between Buffalo or Albany.
There was no Western New York. It's just upstate and everything else.
Yeah, exactly. So, I made that move, really got lucky. I mean, I love Western New York. Part of my retirement plan is not to leave, at least not to leave during the summer.
Right.
I'll spend half the year here for sure for the rest of my life if I can do it.
Yeah.
And obviously the career turned out okay as well.
Yeah, well, I would say so. And let's get into that actually. So let's dive into, so you're at M&T, you move to Buffalo, you pack up and move. And I would assume at that point, you're invested at this point. You're like, okay, I've moved and I'm working for this company.
Yep.
Again, this is probably hard to answer now, but did you have a plan in mind? I mean, was it, hey, I want to lead a division. I want to do X, Y, or Z. Or, there are people that get into things and say, hey, I want to eventually be on the executive team. Walk through that. Did you ever have those thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I was ambitious, and I had aspirations to, achieve higher and higher levels of presence in the organization and responsibility. And, the big thing, certainly when I was sort of making my way early on, was to get onto the management group, because the management group at that point was just 12 people who were responsible for the day-to-day, operating decision-making and strategy for the bank. And so that was a lofty aspiration. Never really thought I could get there.
And was the bank around 20 billion at the time in assets?
No. Well, when I started at M&T, we were 5.9 billion in assets. Wow. We had 2,300 employees and 5.9 billion in assets. And when I retired, it's like 210 billion and 23,000 people.
Just crazy. Yeah.
The growth was unreal. I mean, again, it's really, I chalk up a lot of my, career achievement to luck. We were, as we were growing exponentially. There was a tear where we acquired, I think, 23 banks in 25 years.
That's right.
And, it was all hands on deck. And so if you were willing to work hard and participate in that process, you were recognized, and, you had opportunities to get ahead.
So you were thinking management group and thinking, this is where I want to get to. What was I'm trying to remember what when I first met you 26 years ago, 1998, I think you were in product or doing something like that.
When I transferred from, in the New York City subsidiary, I was the director of marketing.
Okay.
And most of that, I think the most important aspect of that role was product management, and largely deposit pricing, product development, product positioning, because the East New York Savings Bank was a source of low-cost funding for the rest of the bank. It was largely, skewed towards deposit gathering. Yeah. So when I transferred to Buffalo, I became the deposit product manager. Was probably my first meaningful role.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I acquired responsibility for the other retail products, consumer lending and deposit related products. And you remember Emerson?
Absolutely.
Brumback, Emerson came to us from Bank One and ran all of retail, and he reorganized, and he said to me, I want you to go home and think about what was called at the time electronic banking.
I remember electronic banking. That's right.
I said, okay. And, I came back, and he reorganized, and he put me in charge of creating this electronic banking group, which was basically consolidating all the ATM related businesses that we had, on-premise and off-premise businesses, and to figure out the internet. And so one of the first,
incredible, isn't it?
I know, one of the first, contributions I made was developing, the bank's first website. I remember in the Ithaca region, Susan Sierra at the time, Susan McDonald, as you remember, she built a little website and manufactured T-shirts that she was giving out at Student Rush, and they said, surf with us at mntbank.com, and she spelled com C-O-M-M. I wish, so just to give you an idea how
she might have been ahead of her time though, because these are .co. I mean, we all variations now.
But C-O-M-M, it's just funny. I wish I had one of those T-shirts. It'd be a collector's item. Yeah. But anyway, we stumbled our way onto the internet and created our first website, and then we created our first transactional banking site, M&T Online, and then we did the same for business banking, and those were my early responsibilities.
There's probably some Gen Z are going to be watching this thinking, did Rich invent the internet?
Yeah. No, definitely not.
Oh my gosh, electronic banking. That's hysterical. I totally forgot that nomenclature. That's funny.
And really great people, flow through that assignment.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So at what point, and it may have been distant from that experience, and there must have been a point at which, I think everybody has one in their career where they're assigned a role, or they apply for a role, or whatever, that changes the trajectory of their career, whether they were kind of going sideways, whether they were just kind of matriculating up a little bit. At some point you get a bump, or there's something where this is the moment. Did you have one of those?
Yeah.
And what was it?
And you were part of it.
Oh,
as you might recall.
I do. Yeah.
So, again, I was lucky. I mean, Emerson saw something in me that I didn't know I had or didn't see in myself. And he pulled me out of product, technical. I was doing all of the due diligence work for the acquisitions that we made. I was always deeply involved in all of that. He saw something that, others may not have seen. So again, I mean, luck is such a key story to the career trajectory. And he gave me responsibility for half of the branch network. Yep. And then ultimately I acquired responsibility for the entire branch network. Right. And then all the other pieces of retail that I had more experience in, like product management, electronic banking, all sort of pulled together to a point where, I ultimately had responsibility for all of retail. But to your question, the key toggle point was, I was running product management areas, maybe at the time had, 50, 60 people working for me. Yeah. We worked hard. My management style was probably harsh. It was get the job done, and work round the clock to do it. And all of that.
And that was a lot of the culture though, too, at M&T.
Absolutely.
Right? That was
absolutely
probably what you came up with.
And it was required. I mean, because if you were doing due diligence, you had to get the numbers in, you had to get them right. You had to run the gauntlet to defend the numbers you put in. I mean, it was hard work. I mean, I remember working, good 80, 90 hours a week back during that clip. But when I acquired responsibility for the branches, it was a whole new game for me. Yeah. I wasn't a teller. I didn't come up through the ranks per se. I was responsible for literally thousands of people.
Yeah, sure.
And, it occurred to me that understanding something about the way people work and managing people effectively was going to be the key to being successful, as opposed to, being the technical expert that knew everything about deposits or, consumer credit or whatever it was. That was an important toggle point for me because it forced me to learn how to be a more effective general manager. Sure. And I think that role was the gateway to a lot of the positions, that I acquired subsequently.
And I think too, specifically at M&T at the time, so that was probably what, 2004, 5?
Yeah, it was right. Just around All First, just before. It was like 2003.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think at the time, if I think back, a lot of the people who had key responsibilities in the bank had spent some time on the retail side of the bank.
Yeah. Retail was always viewed as a net exporter of talent in the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. And also too, we'll get into this because I think you hit on what I want to eventually take the conversation, which is around management style and your passion around precision leadership and behavioral science. I want to get to that. Maybe that was what ultimately triggered some of that thought. And we'll jump into that. Before we get into that though, so you're doing the retail thing, your responsibilities have expanded. You're, arguably probably the most critical part of the bank because it's the customer facing part of any bank really is the retail side. And then from there, I believe, if you have to correct me on this one, you went into the chief risk officer role, or was there a stop in between? I forget, but
yeah, there was a stop in between.
There was a stop. What was that stop? I'm trying to remember.
So, we had built, I think, a beautiful organization in retail, and I'm really proud of the work we did together. Right. And it was a group effort to really change the way we thought about approaching the customer and our own employees within retail. On January 1st, 2008, I was asked to move over into mortgage and consumer lending.
That's right.
Right at the housing crisis was in full burn, and the great financial crisis was on us, and I was asked to move over and do the work to help keep us safe, and
that was in the old collateralized debt obligation time frame, right? The old CDOs.
Yeah, exactly.
Banks had a bunch of these.
Yep. And M&T, true to form, being, relatively conservative, didn't go as far as anyone else, but we, we were in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that.
And, we were able to sell a lot of what we were originating, the famous Alt-A mortgages and all of that. But then everything dried up. We had to put it on the balance sheet. We had our treasurer had put some of what we originated on the balance sheet. So, we had a fair amount of those kind of loans that were deeply troubled on the balance sheet.
Yeah.
And, there was just a tremendous amount of work to unwind from that, to, keep the mortgage originations and servicing ship afloat, and also, bolster up our collections operation beyond belief. I mean, I think we had 50 people working in collections, or some small number,
Sure.
At the outset. And Bob Wilmers, God bless him, saw he saw this tsunami coming, and every day he called and he said, do we have enough people? Do we have enough people? Do we have enough people? And we ramped up. We had like 400 people going into the heart of the crisis, and it made a big difference in terms of keeping people in their homes and keeping the bank safe.
You bring up a name that is familiar to a lot of people in Buffalo and M&T, certainly. Bob Wilmers. Actually, let's take a quick detour on that, because I wanted to ask you about people that you've worked with that were influential, obviously. I mean, for those who maybe aren't familiar, Bob Wilmers, probably one of the most legendary bankers
in the industry,
and who had passed, unfortunately, several years back. But you worked with him directly. What was his superpower? Like, what made him as good as he was? Because he just, you'd see him in the elevator. He was the most kind person. He'd invite people over to his home, and I was there having dinner, and he'd ask you 800 questions. And he'd been a good podcast host, by the way. Now I think about it, he asked a lot of questions. What'd you take away from your time with him?
Yeah, well, you kind of just touched upon it. I mean, his superpower, most would say that he was a question machine.
Yeah.
He was extraordinarily curious, and he never fully felt like he had the right answer. He never thought. He was so humble, right?
Oh, very
and he
humble.
was just so regular in so many ways, and so relatable because of that. And here's this, incredibly powerful, iconic character, but he was so approachable, so
he was.
Relatable. He never thought he had the answer himself, and he always sought input from, multiple facets around a particular problem that he was interested in. And, he just was constantly probing and digging and talking to different people from different facets to try to get to the best decision, the best viewpoint he could.
You were very similar to that, though, too. Now, in retrospect, now that I think about it, you would always ask questions.
Yeah, and that's because I didn't know anything. So he knew stuff. He knew stuff. He was validating.
Yeah,
he was validating what he knew. Me, I didn't know anything. I had to ask questions. But to your point earlier, it's the M&T way. It's that high level of personal accountability. Don't ride a high horse. Don't assume you know the answer. If you stumbled upon an answer, it's an answer. It's not the answer. Keep digging. And Bob was unbelievable. Like if you went to him with a proposal or a something you've uncovered and you sort of laid it out, he'd ask you 10 questions that would prompt you to go back and dig below the veneer. Like he was really a prospector. Like, dig deeper. Go deeper, see what else is there before you come back and say, exactly what we should do, because you got to exhaust it. And that sort of, I don't want to oversimplify it, but that sense of measure twice, cut once, be really probing, really understand, don't think you know the answer, kept the bank out of trouble through a lot of, and frankly, the bank's growth was because others around us stumbled and we stayed strong. And, he saw that as an incredible opportunity to differentiate our institution from any other bank in the industry.
And it always seemed to be the case. Whenever there was a macro issue, M&T always seemed to just somehow, I say somehow, it turned out it wasn't luck. I mean, some of it might have been, but it was always managed to avoid the worst of it.
Yeah. He was a detail guy. He expected people to have a sense of personal accountability and to know the details. He was all about the details. And a lot of us, Renee's the same way.
Sure.
A lot of us grew up being grilled, grilled. I mean, so when you went to meet with Bob, or you went to ALCO or one of the key operating committees at the bank, you were hyper prepared for anything. Because part of the way that you got ahead was demonstrating that you mastered all of the details. And he drove the whole organization to that level.
That's true.
You and I have talked about it, you probably don't remember, but in the early days of setting up the risk organization, Bob was a believer that every individual employee was responsible for risk.
Yes.
And he didn't want to concentrate risk management ownership in one place, because he thought it would help people abdicate their ownership of the risk issues that they face every day.
Yeah.
And so when we were setting up the risk organization, we had to thread that needle.
Absolutely.
We had to make sure that the culture of the bank was such that people understood their personal responsibility.
Yeah.
And there was this overarching framework that helped us think more clearly about the kind of risks we engage in.
No doubt. And, it's funny because I remember when I got thrown into the frying pan, I think you might have thrown me into it.
Glad to have you.
Yeah, right. Thanks. Welcome.
Come on in. The water's fine.
Yeah, go there for 30
love
days.
It here.
I remember you said to me, go over to, we had this new building at Larkin. We've got all these people. I just need to get a handle on what's happening over there. Can you go over there for 30 days and just kind of, give me a call each day. Let me know what's happening. And that turned into 5.5 years. But I remember when it started because I knew at the time, it was such a high intensity period of time because, regulators involved, that was stuff. And I'll never forget the first call I got was about reporting a number. We had to report a number, suspicious activity reports or something like that. And to be honest, we had the number obviously, but to find who actually had the right number was challenging because we had 400 and some people from all different places, contractors, and I remember when I hit send on this number of how many we thought there were, I'm like, please God, tell me this is right. Because if there's one person that's going to know and ask questions, it would probably have been him because he was obviously asking the question. Yeah. Management group was asking it through him. And I remember the number was wrong. And, that was not a good moment. But anyway, but funny to have the CEO asking about a number that was honestly, of all the numbers that there were, an important one, but I'm thinking, why in the world are they asking this number? And then to not have the right one was not good either. But anyhow, so then you become chief risk officer.
Yeah. What happened was after, the crisis sort of subsided, I picked up business banking in that space. But the main thing was that we had announced the acquisition of Hudson City.
That's right.
Savings Bank down in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And the team was solid. The people in mortgage, the people in mortgage were unbelievable. Yeah. The Mike Todoros, Mike Drews.
Oh, sure.
They knew their stuff. And Janet Coletti was running business banking, who's, extraordinarily competent. Yep. So it created an opportunity for me to sort of, on paper, have responsibility for those areas, but really they were running the show.
Sure.
And then I was spending 3 days a week down in New Jersey helping to create the transition momentum for Hudson City. The reason why I got involved in risk was, we ran right into a brick wall.
Yeah.
HSBC had gotten,
absolutely
in gigantic trouble with their BSA AML program.
Yep.
And, the regulators start to look at all banks more deeply. And, we were marching down the road to acquire Hudson City thinking no problem. And all of a sudden, boom, we ran into a brick wall and they started to scrutinize our program and they didn't feel it was where it needed to be for the size we were going to get to with that acquisition. I got hauled back from New Jersey and then I was helping on BSA AML. We had Don Truslow was our chief risk officer at the time. And then ultimately Don moved on and I got invited to become the chief risk officer.
Arguably though, as you talk about your career trajectory, and this is, I think, one of the biggest things in anybody's career is if you can do multiple things across multiple disciplines, there's nothing better that prepares you than being able to do that.
Right.
Where you're not just a one trick pony, if you will. You're not just staying in one lane. You're doing a whole host of things. Right. Because ultimately then you become president of the bank.
Yeah.
Chief operating officer, president of the bank, which I would guess, and I'd love your take on this, would have been hard to do without having that broad understanding of, product, electronic banking and the internet, retail, business banking, all the core businesses. But then you were also doing the risk side of things.
Yeah.
Talk about the moment where you've earned and you're told, hey, you're now the president of the bank. And you're probably reflecting back on your food and beverage days thinking, holy hell.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I what you say is, I think, spot on. The CRO job was not pleasant.
Right.
I always tell people I lost 20 pounds during that tenure that I'll never get back.
I think I did too. Yeah.
But I would have never been able to become, I don't think I would have become the president and chief operating officer if I didn't do that 3-year stint.
Yeah.
And two reasons really. One, it gave me a very horizontal view of the entire enterprise beyond areas that I ever had direct responsibility for. But also it was a test case, because what Bob and others needed to see was that in a position of high authority across, related to my colleagues, because we had to all snap too. I mean, we had to do what had to be done. Yep. And I was put in the responsibility to figure out what had to be done. Yep. And so it was really a test in terms of how did I interact with my colleagues who were running big pieces of the bank, big organizations. Yep. Was I able to present myself in a way where I was okay, where it worked. We had good working relationships and all of that. And, luckily the whole entire management team worked very well together. We put up our enterprise risk framework and did the things we needed to do. And that was sort of a test case for me. And I think it probably made Bob and others more comfortable that I was capable of leading at a high level. Yeah. And
you're dealing with different stakeholders at that point. As a CRO, I mean, you're talking to regulators daily. Yeah. Those conversations.
And that's a big part of it. One of the things that I think was so effectively powerful for Rene as he ascended into the CEO job was, as CFO for a decade or so. Yep. He was well known in the outside world, and he knew how to interact with folks outside the bank in meaningful ways. And that's important. And I got at least a bit of that, through my role in the CRO position. Yeah. And so it really, I'll never complain about that CRO job. I did a lot when I had it.
Oh, absolutely.
It was painful. Yeah. But it was the key to allowing me to ascend to that next level.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think risk and compliance, that's obviously what my company does. We do that on a smaller scale for community banks and fintechs and things of that sort, but it's never going away. No. I mean, in fact, arguably it's going to continue to ratchet up. The expectations will always continue to ratchet up.
It'll be ever changing.
Yeah. The regs will change, the laws will change, and you got to stay a step ahead of it, in line with it. So it's just one of those things. And again, I mean, everything will change in some regard. Retail banking changes, business banking changes, mortgage, all that stuff changes. And it ebbs and flows. Maybe you have 10 people in a branch in 1990, now you have 3, and all that stuff changes. Risk and compliance changes, but tends to change to say your expectation level goes up and up and up, and the requirements go higher and higher. So to have that background is really important. So let's kind of shift if we could, because in 2000, you have to correct me on this one, but sometime probably around 2005, 6, 7, somewhere in that range. And maybe it's part of what you were talking about in terms of your career and having to now, I went from managing 60 people in product to managing thousands of people. You brought forth to the bank a whole new way of thinking about how to manage people, and not even so much manage people, but deal with people. And it was founded around the science of precision leadership. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I'm sure anybody who works at a large company, you probably get books handed to you. They collect dust, and it's the book of the year. It's like, oh, you got to read this book. Like one of them, I remember back in the day was Who Moved My Cheese or whatever the story. So. Right. And I remember,
there's plenty of them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You brought forward this book at the time called Bringing Out the Best
in People
by Aubrey Daniels. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure everybody at the time thought, okay, here's another book. Fast forward 20 some years, and I'm sure that you've touched thousands of people with this whole idea. And I want you to maybe just kind of explain the core of it, because you're an adjunct professor. You teach graduate level courses at University of Buffalo about this very topic. Right. This is really core to who you are and what you've been and are. Talk to us about why you decided and when you decided I need to bring some cohesive way that we all need to be dealing with people at the bank. And you brought this forward. Talk about how that came about, why you love it so much, which I think we all do, and what you're doing with it today, because I think you're still very active.
Sure. So that's a big question.
Yeah.
So before I even say anything, I just want to give attribution where it's due. I mean, it is a part of me, and I believe strongly in it, and I'm very passionate about it, and that's why I teach and I do seminars and things like that, because it is crucially important for anyone who is entrusted with responsibility for other people, or simply are in positions where they need to influence other people. And that doesn't necessarily have to just be on the job. Mm-hmm. It is crucially important for people to understand just fundamentally why people behave the way they do.
Right.
Because if you don't understand what triggers behavior, you really put yourself at a disadvantage in trying to effectively manage to better outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Because all outcomes are driven by behavior. I mean, you pick a problem on planet Earth
Mm-hmm.
and keep peeling back the onion. When you get to the core of it, someone's behaving badly.
Yep.
And it will be the case in an AI world. Someone programmed badly, or
Mm-hmm.
someone, missed a digit or whatever.
Yep.
There'll always be a behavioral element to the challenges in life, and more so on the job perhaps than
Sure.
anywhere else, because you rely on good, committed people with a sense of personal accountability and all the things that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So I owe really the fiber of my being to Dr. Daniels, who's a dear friend and mentor, and David Ewell and others that we've worked worked with at Aubrey Daniels International all these years. So a little bit about how we got it, and then about what it is.
Sure.
In 2001, so it starts.
Wow.
Well, the implementation really was in the time frame you talked about in retail. Retail was really ground zero for it.
Yeah.
Because the seed didn't take more broadly across the bank. Otherwise, it would have been more broadly accepted, a couple of years prior. In 2001, the bank conducted its very first employee engagement survey.
Okay. Yeah.
And it said what most of them subsequently continue to say, perhaps, because it's a never-ending job.
Mm-hmm.
But that one was rattling, because what it said, one of the core findings of it was that we didn't do a good job at M&T of managing people performance.
Mm-hmm.
It was a performance management issue at the bank. And what was interesting about it was when you investigated and researched what was behind the answers to that question, if you were a high performer,
mm-hmm.
you resented the fact that you weren't recognized and rewarded in a sufficiently differentiated way from average performers.
Sure.
You can,
absolutely.
Everyone got the same performance rating because, the manager didn't want to deal with telling you were a 2 and then having everyone say, how come that person's a 4? Totally. So you give everyone a 3,
peanut butter.
So high performers really resented it.
Sure.
I mean, they wanted to feel like recognized and rewarded in a distinct way for their outsized contribution.
Yeah.
And then equally interesting is folks that were more moderate or lower performers resented the fact that they were typecast and the organization didn't invest any time, resources, or energy in helping them be better. They weren't getting the feedback that they needed.
Yeah.
And so one of the leaders of the bank at the time, in essence, commissioned 7 of us, 7 senior managers, senior leaders, to go off and solve the people performance management problem. And so we got together in a room and, we ultimately decided this is what we need to do. We need to rewrite the performance appraisal form to make it, more hard hitting.
Yep.
And then we need to teach all managers how to be more candid with the feedback they provide.
Yep.
Not horrible. I mean,
sure,
it's pretty good stuff.
Yep.
And we went off and we're rewriting the form, so that at the annual review, someone will get more candid feedback and that will be helpful.
Right.
Well, in the midst of all this, again, luck is incredibly important in a career. No matter how talented you are, without luck, you're not going to make it. Yep. I got hit with a direct mail piece for a seminar called Managing People for Maximum Performance out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And it was conducted by this Dr. Aubrey Daniels. I didn't know who Aubrey was and, all of that at that time. And I looked at the content of the seminar, and it was right on point to what we were trying to solve. So the 7 of us that were appointed to solve the problem flew up to Boston, and we went to this 2-day seminar in Cambridge. And it was what you would know to be the 2-day precision leadership training that
absolutely.
We do at the bank to this day.
Yeah.
And I can only speak to myself. I mean, I think we were all affected by it, but I was deeply affected because, as we talked about, I had just ascended to responsibility for lots and lots of people in the retail job. I was trying to figure out how do I make a difference? How can I be of influence in an organization that, like I said, I wasn't a teller. I wasn't a platform person. I wasn't a branch manager.
Yeah.
What contribution could I make to the cause that would make a difference, in the organization and in the performance of the individuals in the organization? And so anyway, we came back from Cambridge and realizing, oh my God, performance management is not an annual thing. It's an everyday thing.
Absolutely.
It's an every minute thing.
Yeah.
And, we have to rethink what we're doing. And ultimately, we brought Aubrey to the bank at a senior management meeting, and we started to introduce the concepts and all that. And for various reasons, which we can talk about if you want, the seed didn't take, but the seed took with me.
Sure.
I mean, I was changed forever, and I came to believe that if I could uniquely bring to the table a capability to help people be more effective at managing others, I could let we had myriad people who were finance experts and marketing experts and communication experts, but I could carve this out and make a difference in the bank by being the guy that focused on this. And I started in the retail bank. And so to the rest of your question, what it is, we called it precision leadership at the bank, but it's organizational behavior management is what it is. And that's what I teach, and that's what it is. Dr. Daniels is widely considered the father of organizational behavior management. And what it is basically this. You've got the field of behavior analysis, popularized and really pulled together by B.F. Skinner, who most people might have heard of in a Psych 101 course or something like that. But there's this field called behavior analysis. Probably 98%, don't hold me to the numbers, but like 98% of the PhDs in behavior analysis go off and they work in a clinical setting, working with people, kids with autism, et cetera. 2%, perhaps something like 2% of people who understand behavior analysis apply it in other realms outside of the clinical setting. Basically, that realm is considered what's called applied behavior analysis, taking what we know about human behavior and applying it to different things. Organizational behavior management is the study or the field where people take what we know about human behavior and apply it specifically to the workplace in an effort to achieve greater outcomes and drive higher levels of engagement, et cetera. And so I'm all about that.
Sure.
I mean, that is my passion. That's what I believe in. And so since 2001, for the last 23 years, I've invested my time and effort. And as you well know, in your days in retail and in risk, we worked hard to make sure that anyone in the company who was entrusted with responsibility for others knew at least the basics of why people behave the way they do, and then how they could use that understanding to build managerial frameworks to create more positive work environments that yield better outcomes.
That's right.
And that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. I mean, it's powerful because, I mean, even to this day, I could tell you, the pick and the nick, like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, something's immediate and certain. And I think about all the business books and things I've read, and, they go in one ear out the other sometimes. This one's stuck. And so I would venture to say, I don't know what percentage of the bank ultimately was exposed to this routinely. I would guess it's almost all of it. Most of it.
Certainly. At one point, shortly before I retired, I think the count was a little over 70% of the employees in the company were working in areas that either fully embraced, were on their way to embracing, or were at the very least exposed to the principles of precision leadership. And I have always believed that common denominator of approach to bringing out the best in people at the bank was a large contributor to the quality of the culture and the level of engagement that we've always enjoyed at the bank.
No doubt.
Precision leadership at the bank, OBM, understanding why people do what they do, is an avenue towards creating an organization filled with people who are willing to walk through walls for the company. And that's what it's all about. It's the only point of differentiation. We look the same as most every other regional bank that we compete with. But if we've got people that are willing, and it always drives me crazy, people, when asked, what's the greatest asset in your organization? We have the best people. Well, I mean, I love the people at M&T Bank. But to say we've cornered the market on the best people, no, Bank of America probably has some pretty good people too. The difference is how you engage them. It's whether you can get your workforce to feel so good about the organization that they work in that they're willing to go the extra mile. They'll walk through a wall for the company and its clients. Yeah. And that's the differentiation. And OBM, or Precision Leadership, creates an avenue for managers to understand how to drive what in the parlance is called discretionary effort.
Absolutely.
Getting people to give you more than what's minimally required each and every day that they report for duty.
Yep. No, it's a great explanation. It's, just listening to it, just brings me back. Now, I will say there was one gripe I always had about it, and I'm sure that others are watching this.
Don't talk blitz fluency.
Blitz fluency testing was like a razor blade to the head. Oh gosh, that's a bad memory. Is sitting there trying to, you'd have to go, for those who don't know, you'd have to answer these questions in some time period. And then if you got one wrong, you went all the way back to the beginning. Oh my gosh, it was, and I'm a terrible test taker as it is. So that was really bad, but
I know the stories of, you're sitting in your office or behind your desk and you're trying desperately to get it right this time. And then all of a sudden someone comes in and says, "Hey, Ryan."
Yeah.
Like, no. Yeah.
Then
you had to go back to the beginning. It's gotten a lot easier. And I don't know if everyone does it anymore. My passion around it was, it's fun. It was like a video game.
Oh, wow.
But the big thing was it drove, like you just talked about picnic. I mean, you're out of the bank, you're doing your own thing.
Yeah.
It's a way to create a level of fluency around the science of behavior that you are then forced to carry as baggage with you for the rest of your life.
There's no doubt.
So it had its purpose.
And you can use it on your kids too. Works on the kids.
If you've ever created a behavior chart for your kids, you're in this space.
I should have actually threatened my kids with having to take blitz fluency testing. Maybe that would have been the better play.
Oh my God. So it's all about understanding human behavior. And behavior chart for kids is creating pinpointed definitions of the behaviors you want to see with a prescribed reward for seeing those. Yeah. Positive reinforcement.
Absolutely. Speaking of Aubrey Daniels, I believe he went to Furman University.
Yeah, he did go to Furman,
which is where my son's going in August.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's going to go. He's moving down to Greenville, South Carolina.
Greenville's wonderful, and Furman's a beautiful campus.
Yeah. So, actually, real quick, funny story about that. The CBA school, banking school, which I went through in like 07, 08, 09. I think 07 was at University of Virginia, and then they found, I think, asbestos in the law school, so they had to relocate the program after like 40 years to Furman. And I had never heard of Furman, so I spent 2 weeks down there for 2 years. That was in 08, let's say 08, 09. Fast forward 13, 14 years, he's applying to colleges. And I said, "Hey, Alex, you should apply to Furman." He's like, "Where's Furman?" I'm like, "It's Greenville. Greenville's beautiful. You should." He's like, "Oh, I'll apply." He applies, and then the rest is history. He gets in and whatever else. So he's going there. God. Yeah, so he's going there.
That's funny. It's funny how the things that happen to us drive happenstance for those around us for years and years to come.
Absolutely. I was telling somebody the other day, if you really think, not to get overly deep on this, but you think about life in general. Let's say you've been alive for 47 years, 50 years, 60 years, whatever. You could probably boil down the things that happen in your life that are kind of momentous or monumental to seconds or minutes in that period of time. Mm-hmm. The moment that you say, "Hey, you're going to go to this banking school," and it's at Furman, just that moment in time leads to him applying.
Because now Furman's in the gravitational pull of your thinking.
It's just so interesting. But
think about, you left M&T for a year and came back. Yeah. You didn't come back.
That's right.
You wouldn't have had that son to go to Furman.
No question about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I left and moved to DC and grad school. It actually had M&T not bought Allfirst and gotten themselves down into that mid-Atlantic market,
right?
Which was the impetus for me to come back.
Right.
It's just wild to think about it.
Yeah.
So if we could just kind of transition to just broadly the industry. I always think about everything these days as pre-COVID and post-COVID, because I think it fundamentally changed business. I think it changed business. I think it changed people's individual drive to do different things. I think it did a whole bunch of things. What's your general take? And I ask everybody who's here. Frank Ewing, the CEO of AML Resource, was on that couch a couple weeks ago.
Ex-M&T banker too.
Ex-M&Ter. He requested a bottle of wine when we did ours, so we had a glass. So we did that. But what's your take on hybrid versus remote versus all this stuff? I mean, it's still a big deal. I think Dell was a month ago called their 60,000 people back, and I think half of them said, "No, thanks, we're all set. We don't need promotions. We don't need more money. We're happy."
Yeah.
And they just basically said, "We're not coming back." What's your general take on all this?
Yeah. Broadly speaking,
yeah,
it's a concern.
Yeah.
I think it has issues and potential potentially damages the sense of culture and also productivity. And the challenge really goes back to what we were talking about with precision leadership.
Yeah.
Most managers and leaders don't know how to manage.
Right.
Most people who are in a position of responsibility for others, they got there in an unwitting way. They were probably the best individual contributor there was. And then someone came up behind them and tapped them on the shoulder and said, "You're the best individual contributor at this work that we've ever known. Now you're going to manage people doing that work."
Right.
And on that day, the person's responsibilities and role changes forever.
Yeah, their superpower that maybe got them
won't get them the next step.
Yep.
And most companies, in fact, I always lament this because I wish I would have cut it out. Years ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about allocation of corporate training dollars in corporate America. And, you know, a lot of it is technical training and that sort of thing. And basically, like 1% of the budget of the aggregate training dollars in this country in businesses was allocated towards helping managers be better. You know, if you're lucky, when you become a manager, you take a course in the legal and ethical implications of management.
Right.
But you don't take precision leadership. You don't learn why people do what they do, and you don't learn your role and how important it is to maintain your credibility to affect their behavior in a way that's additive to the cause. So that was the old way. You know, that's still the issue today.
Sure.
But the thing is, most managers could maybe limp by when the people they were responsible for were right under their noses. Enter a time where you've got those very same managers who do not have the skill to effectively bring out the best in the people they're responsible for. Now they got to manage those people all over the frickin' place.
Remotely, yeah.
I mean, they don't have a prayer.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be effective at setting objectives and expectations, measuring the work, providing candid feedback.
Yep.
I always say, you know, precision, in the end, OBM boils down to two things: clarity and candor. Providing meaningful feedback, reinforcing the right behaviors, and then making sure you're getting the results. Yeah. Most managers can't do that. Yeah. And now they're being asked to do that in a remote workforce. If they were more effective, I would be less concerned about a remote work sort of scheme. It's here to stay. I mean, you know, if I had my druthers, I'd let people work from home on Friday and be in the office Monday through Thursday.
Okay, yeah.
Because the cultural thing is big too. You can't get to a point where people think, and you know, your Dell example is telling. 30,000 people just said, "Well, crap, if you don't want me to work for you under the conditions that I want to work, I'll just go somewhere else. Who cares?"
That's exactly it.
All employers are the same.
Yep.
And so the ability to maintain a differentiation in your culture when people are spread to the winds is very difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think going forward, in my mind, leaders and organizations have two really important challenges. One is to create mechanisms to foster a differentiated culture and make sure that the values that you adopt in your corporate entity are real and people understand them, even if they don't ever report to the mothership, you know? And then the second thing is they've got a responsibility to make sure that managers know how to manage the people in their organization.
Right.
That they can foster the ideals of the values in the culture, and they can pinpoint, measure, provide feedback, reinforce the right behaviors, and evaluate whether they're getting the right results, which is, that's an ADI 5-step process that you know.
I think there are people that potentially function better in a remote environment.
No doubt.
And then I think, you know, like for me personally, you know, and you've known me, I tend to be attracted to, you know, larger groups of people, being able to be in front of them, do that when everything just went, you know, to your home.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's got a specific skill set. Yeah. And when that, for me, that was part of my skill set was that, well, that gets taken away. What are you left with? You're like, oh geez, what am I doing now? Yeah. So it's really interesting. But then there's a group of people that are just really, really good at it.
Absolutely.
And
in sort of in behavior science speak, there are self-motivated people. Yeah. There are people who take, and it's all a matter of their programming from when they were kids. You know, it's what behaviors were reinforced over their entire life, the history and patterns of reinforcement that they experienced their whole lives. There are people who take such joy and pleasure in doing their job, applying their craft really, really well. Yeah. The work itself, the effort itself is what's called naturally reinforcing to them. They don't need a lot of help.
Right.
But not everyone
That's
at
right.
Dell
Yeah.
is naturally reinforced or self-motivated to do the work.
Right.
You got a team like that, you don't need managers. You don't need anything
Sure.
because those people figure it out on their own.
Yeah.
And they're great to have. You want as many as you can get.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no way that everyone is self-motivated. Most workers need social or tangible reinforcement.
Yeah.
They're not naturally reinforced by the work. If you can make the work more exciting, you
Yeah.
can get more people naturally reinforced by the work. But most people need to be managed. They need feedback on how they're doing. They need to know when they've done a good job.
Mm-hmm.
They need that positive reinforcement
Yeah.
for them to be able to produce at levels that are beyond what's minimally required, as we talked about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Unleashing discretionary effort. And if managers don't know how to do that,
Yeah.
the self-motivated people will always be fine. They don't need any oversight.
Yep.
But you're not going to, the best recruiters in the world aren't going to recruit for you 30,000 self-motivated people.
Right. I actually do think too, is we, I'll shift topic here in a second, but there's let's say you're a 25, 26-year-old, 27-year-old. You probably since graduating college have been operating in this remote hybrid world. 25 years from now, those are the very same people who are likely going to be running these companies.
Right.
And if you think about their entry and their experience in corporate America is just vastly different.
Right.
And you would have to think some of this stuff pulls through 25 years from now where, hey, I was a remote